companions, welcome. I want to tell you a bit more about poachers. Most of you probably don't even know about the existence of poachers and haven't come across them at all, because in game reserves there aren't supposed to be any poachers. But in the wilderness areas where I wander around, I regularly come across them or signs of them. And as I've told you in a previous video, I think of poachers in kind of three categories. The first are the protein poachers, the guys that poach to stay alive. Second are the killer gangs. Those are the guys that strip the bush for their own commercial gain. And then there are the assignment killers. Those are the guys that go after rhino horn and ivory and predator parts and so on. But let me tell you a bit about my experiences with the protein poachers first. Most of my connection to protein poachers come from my need to find a good local bush guide. A local bush guide can be worth his weight in gold. He can save me days of wandering around trying to find a good spot with water and an abundance of game. If he's good, I can learn a lot from him, possibly about the wilderness that I don't know. And if I'm really lucky, I can develop a kind of a companionship with him. Good guides are really hard to find. And I thought I'd read a bit from some of the stuff I've written about my experiences with protein poachers over the years to illustrate all this. The first is from a book that I've recently published. I call it About as Far as One Can Go. I will tell you more about it in due course. Nature is rich in wonders. She sometimes reveals herself in dramatic or brutal ways, but for the most, her revelations are arcane hints and whispers that remain obscure to all but the finest tuned senses and the subtlest intuitions. Reading them is part art, part skill. To find people who are even aware of her less dramatic expressions, let alone decipher and understand them, is remarkable. It takes a lifetime of learning in the school of the veld to develop the sharpness of senses and the keenness of intuition. End of quote. Now, protein poachers fit this profile best. They live off the veld in the way that hundreds of generations before them had lived off the veld. They need the sharpest of senses, the highest level of bush knowledge and skill to be able to survive. They are found on the edges of the wilderness and inside the wilderness in little bush villages or clusters of huts. And they are so isolated by days of walking and traveling by road from the world that we know, that they are hardly aware of the laws and regulations that get promulgated in the modern world. And they don't feel any obligation to adhere to them. The next passage is also from About as Far as One Can Go. As I reach the faint trails that mark the furthest reaches of the middle world's penetration into the great wilderness, I would search for footpaths and signs that tell of the denizens of this fringe world. When I find something that looks promising, I would follow it. Usually, it would lead me into a little cluster of huts. There I would greet, chat, make some careful general remarks, and then finally more specific questions. Each stop could take an hour or more, and I know I might not find a good guide today, maybe not even tomorrow, but I would spend the time. A good companion is a precious thing. End of quote. My next quote is from another book that I wrote some time ago called The Wanderers, and I quote from The Wanderers for you. I was lucky to find a wily old bush character called Mazenya to act as my guide and tracker. He'd come highly recommended by the patrons of a shebeen. Now, a shebeen is a kind of low-class drinking hall. Several of them boisterously proclaimed his credentials from the smoke-darkened interior of what was once, in colonial days, the storeroom of a small shop. It had since been put to less reputable use by the owner. The crumbling structure had lost part of one wall. It had a counter, fashioned from 2 empty oil drums with some rough planks placed over them, and a few tree stumps to serve as seats for the patrons and the hostesses that kept them company were scattered around the room, if you want to call it a room. The only thing fresh and in abundant supply was a stock of Mozambican beer, which was stacked unceremoniously behind the counter. It was shabby and seedy, and probably a little dangerous for a lone white man. You can be sure I checked to make sure there was a clear escape route for me to take if things got unfriendly. By then, I had already lost a day in fruitless inquiries in and around the ragged little villages in the area, and I decided to throw in my lot with the famous man. But he was not in the village. I had to go and find him in the bush. And I did, after about 4 or 5 hours of hard bush driving. Actually, I think it's probably more accurate to say that he found me. Mazenya did in fact think of himself as famous. Once he had overcome his suspicions that I might be the agent of some trouble for him, he became very talkative, loudly informed me with much arm-waving that he was the son of a chief and that he had been widely recognized in the time of the Portuguese as the best tracker. He certainly knew the area I wanted to explore quite well, and he was able to make good suggestions of spots where I could make my temporary camps. As a field guide or tracker, he was impressive too, with a rich knowledge of bush life, big and small. Good as he was not quite as good as another companion I had on a different safari. His name was Elias. I quote from The Wanderers again. We found some promising tracks leaving the pan towards the southeast. They were of a group of 3 bulls, 2 big ones and a younger one. They were fresh, not more than 3 or 4 hours old, and Elias and I silently nodded at each other that we should try to find them. The 3 bulls were following a well-trodden elephant path, with several other sets of tracks on it. And the challenge was to keep following the right set of tracks. This was where my tracking skills came short, and I had to rely on Elias's bush sense. He walked leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped behind his back, his fighting stick dangling loosely from between 2 fingers, appearing to seldom look directly at the spoor, but rather a bit ahead and around, muttering under his breath in a low drone, mimicking the movements of the bulls as he went. I enjoyed watching him, completely absorbed in his work. His low mumbling blended in with the murmur of the leaves in the wind and the buzz of the bird calls. After an hour, I was beginning to get worried that we were wasting our time, But then Elias suddenly veered off the track and headed south. He walked back at a slight angle to the elephant path. I could immediately see that he is no longer following any tracks. But I couldn't really find out from him what he had in mind because of the language barrier. So I had to trust his judgment. 15 minutes later, he triumphantly pointed out the tracks to me, leading off to the south. The bulls had evidently left the path some way back, probably in the area where the ground was very hard and it was difficult to be sure. But Elias had clearly noticed something, and he had suspected they had veered off, and he had noted their general direction, but he had carried on for a bit along the path to make sure before he went back. Once he was sure, he cut across to intersect them rather than going back to the turn-off point, and he was able to know that the tracks we were now staring down at were the very same ones. I was in the hands of a true master of the bush. And what a delight, what a privilege to watch him work, noticing every detail, getting deeper into the minds of the animals, almost becoming the animals at that point in the past. I spontaneously shook his hand, and I could see that the fact that I understood and appreciated what he was doing and how fine it was gave him satisfaction. Companions, those were a few stories about my interaction with the protein poachers. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you're going to join me again next week for another story about poachers.